The world is becoming economically more integrated. Legal barriers to trade and financial flows are being reduced by the World Trade Organization and others. Communication and information flows are getting easier and cheaper, so work can be segmented all around the world and in that process coordinated as part of global production. The costs of transporting economic output are falling. Not just the costs of shipping physical output by plane or truck or boat, although those are falling, but also the costs of shipping output of services over phone lines and the internet. The buzzword that sums up this process is globalization. And even citizens of the United States, the largest economy in the world, can't afford to ignore the rest of the world. Or, as I sometimes think, the world as a whole has more than 6 billion people in it. The U.S. has 300 million. It's kind of interesting to know what the rest of humanity is up to. When we're reviewing the global economic scene, it's useful to begin by looking at GDP and population for the world, and then for major groups of countries around the world. A standard breakdown is first to separate out the high-income economies, the largest of which are the United States, countries of the European Union, and Japan. Then once we've done that, divide the world into regions. The regions are East Asia and the Pacific, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, the Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And so my goal here is to give you an overview, a rapid tour, if you will, of the world economy. When we look at the world economy as a whole, world GDP is about $32 trillion in 2002. World population in that year was 6.2 billion people. So you divide those two, per capita GDP for the world as a whole is approximately $5,200. Let's think first of all about the high-income countries of the world. That would include, again, the United States, Western Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. It also includes Israel and Singapore and a few of the richer, small, oil exporting sheikdoms in the Middle East. Combined, these countries have about 16% of world population, but they produce 80% of world GDP. If you look at the countries of this region sort of loosely, since it's all over the world, per capita GDP is roughly $27,000 a person. Now, each of these economies faces various issues and problems, and we've talked about many of them in these lectures, including unemployment rates, budget deficits, how to pay for an aging population, and other issues. However, this group of countries as a whole also seems to keep racking up growth rates, average growth rates of 2 and 3% per year, over and over and over. These countries, most of them, have enormous fundamental strengths. They have well-educated workforces and good human capital. They have strong rates of investment in physical capital. They are good at developing and using technology. They have really good functional market institutions. Since I've talked a lot about the U.S. and a lot of these issues, I'm just going to leave that region, the high-income countries, at that. And let's look around the rest of the world. The largest economies in the East Asia and Pacific region include China and the countries sometimes called the East Asian Tigers, and those would include Indonesia, South Korea, and Thailand. These countries have 30% of world population, with China accounting for 2/3 of that. China has 20% of world population all by itself. But these countries produce about 6% of world output. Per capita GDP for the region, which is heavily influenced by China, is about $1,000. Notice that this is something like 1/25th or 1/27th the per capita GDP of the high-income countries. Nonetheless, this region is the world's major economic success story of the last few decades. Real GDP growth in this region averaged 7.3% per year from 1990 to 2002. And remember, this period includes the deep financial crash and the extraordinary recession that were experienced by many countries of East Asia in 1997 and 1998. How have they managed to grow so fast? Well, it's a combination of good fundamentals. very high savings rate, very high domestic investment rates, a major effort to build human capital through expanding public education, raising everyone up through different levels, first a 6th grade level, then a 9th grade level, then a 12th grade level of education. They've had a great willingness to import technology and learn how to do things and use that technology. And they've had a great willingness to integrate very effectively into the world economy. In China as well, the move away from a planned, centralized economy into a market-oriented economy has allowed that economy to have an enormous boost. This region, East Asia and Pacific, is the good news of the world economy in a lot of ways. The largest economy in the region of Eastern Europe and Central Asia is Russia, but other large economies in this region include Poland and Turkey. This region has about 7.5% of world population, but it produces only about 3.5% of world output. Per capita GDP for this region is about $2,400. Now, this is, vastly better than China, well over double the levels in the East Asia and Pacific region, but it's only about 1/10 the level of the high-income countries. I still look back and wonder sometimes, sort of thinking about that time from the 1950s well into the 1980s, when people used to talk about the economy of the old USSR as if it was roughly comparable to the economy of the United States or to the economy of Europe. Many people, including, I'd add, a lot of economists, were fooled by the Soviet champions and the space program and what looked like certain well-developed parts of the city of Moscow in the old Soviet Union. But all that time, the Soviet Union, now Russia and all the surrounding countries, actually had economies that were a lot closer to Mexico or Brazil than to the United States level. Economies in this region have had extraordinary difficulties in the 1990s. In fact, the real GDP of this region is actually lower in 2002 than it was in 1990. As Russia and countries of Eastern Europe opened up to market forces in the early 1990s, their economies just almost nearly collapsed from the shock of it all. But by the early 2000s, Russia and other economies in the region have begun to grow at a more reasonable and robust pace. It seems that getting rid of decades of antiquated practices and built-in subsidies and dysfunctional legal institutions is extraordinarily painful for an economy. But that transition, as we enter the 21st century, is largely over. Getting a functioning government in these countries with regular taxes and regular laws was very hard. But now it's largely in place. These countries do have some real advantages. They typically have well-educated populations by world standards, and they typically have pretty good ties to the wealthy economies of Europe. So the growth prospects for this region of Russia and the surrounding countries are surely better now that they have made the change over to being more market-oriented economies. Our next region is Latin America and the Caribbean region. And the biggest economies in this region would be Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. This region has 9% of world population and produces only 5% of world GDP. The per capita GDP for the region is about $3,200. Now again, for those of us who still sometimes fall back into thinking about the US versus the old Soviet Union, it's really striking that this region has more people, a larger economy, and higher per capita GDP than does Russia and the countries that used to be part of the USSR. In the 1970s and 1980s, these countries of Latin America and the Caribbean had some extraordinary problems. They had enormous government debts and suffered through a number of financial crashes. They had inward-looking trade policies where they often tried to nurture their infant industries and avoid any kind of imports in a way that did not help produce long-term growth. They often suffered from horrendous inflation and enormous government budget deficits, where aggregate demand was just soaring and inflation rates often verged into hyperinflation. But now, as we're a few years into the 21st century, these countries have more or less shaped up their macroeconomic policies. They've certainly tamed their hyperinflation. They have largely, although not entirely, given up on protecting infant industries. They've reduced price controls. In many cases, they've sold off part of what were government-owned firms. Their economic performance has picked up, but it's fair to say that the pickup so far has really only been moderate, not as much as people had hoped for. Real per capita GDP for many countries in this region actually declined during the 1980s. In Latin America, the 1980s are sometimes called the lost decade for economic growth. But growth in real GDP from 1990 up through the early 2000s was 2.9% per year. This is both encouraging and discouraging. I mean, it's obviously better than having another lost decade, but that 2.9% a year is just a touch better growth than the high-income countries of the world. And Latin America and the Caribbean aren't going to do much catching up to the high-income countries if they only grow at that pace. My suspicion is that the countries of Latin America really need to deal with some enormous inequalities that they face in education levels, in healthcare, and in how these enormous inequalities create a breeding ground for populism and for corruption in a way that doesn't work well with good economic policy. It's also true that this part of the world needs to get serious about competing in the world economy. There's a lot of good rhetoric, but the region still has far too many barriers to markets and to trade. And in particular, it has too many barriers with trading across Latin America and the Caribbean. Not so much worried about trading with the rest of the world, but just trade within the region itself isn't working especially well. Our next region is the Middle East and North Africa. And the largest economies in that region would include Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Egypt. For the record, Israel, as I think I mentioned before, is counted in the high-income countries of the world, and so are a couple of the small, rich, oil-exporting countries like Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. This region has about 5% of world population and 2% of world output. Per capita GDP is about $2,200. Now, given the geopolitical importance of this region, and especially the constant discussion of oil, I think it always comes as a bit of a shock that in economic terms, this region just isn't very big. If it wasn't for oil, it would barely play a role in the world economy at all. And so I think that as we look at that region, we think about what role it plays in the world economy, we sort of need to think about whether it's likely to be catching up. Real GDP in this region grew at 3.2% per year from 1990 up through the early 2000s, and that's a little better than the high-income countries. But the long-term economic prospects for this region are only so-so at best. Human capital investment in the Middle East region has historically been low. It's not a well-educated region, especially for women. Other than the oil industry, investment in physical capital has also been very low. Market institutions, like the financial and legal underpinnings of a market economy, are not well developed. Political freedom is limited. Rates of population growth have been high. In the early decades of the 21st century, the Middle East region is going to experience a very large infusion of young workers with low levels of education, and it is not at all clear how these workers are going to be absorbed. The oil industry is very capital intensive. It's not going to hire them. The governments have large budget deficits, by and large. They're not likely to provide government jobs, and the private sector hasn't shown an ability to expand and draw in these new workers that are going to be there. In the South Asia region, the largest economy by far is India, but other large countries in the region include Pakistan and Bangladesh. This region has about 22% of world population, but it only produces 2% of world GDP. Per capita GDP in this region is $460. This region is obviously extremely poor, but there are at least some mildly encouraging signs. From 1990 into the early 2000s, real GDP in this region grew at 5.4% per year, roughly double the rate of high-income economies. So there's some catch-up going on there. In particular, India seems to be reducing what used to be an extremely heavy level of regulation in its economy and moving more toward market incentives and more toward an orientation in the world economy. You hear a lot now about India as a new center for offshore or outsourced production. Now, frankly, as of the mid-2000s, this talk is a little bit overdone. It sometimes sounds as if India is already on the verge of being a major global economic power, and it is considerably premature to think that. But still, there is some real strength in certain parts of India's economy, especially in trade and services. In the region of sub-Saharan Africa, the largest economy by far is South Africa. The most populous country is Nigeria. There are a total of 48 countries in this region of sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, it has 11% of the world's population, but it produces only 1% of world GDP. Per capita GDP is roughly $460 for the region, roughly the same as the South Asia region. Although Africa's economic picture is just gloomy, there are some intriguing signs. Levels of education and measures of health in Africa have improved substantially in recent decades. Since about 1960, for example, the rate of mortality for children under the age of 5 has fallen by more than half in Africa. In 1960, maybe 1 or 2% of the population attended secondary school in Africa. Now in many countries it's 30% or 40%. So, there is some sign of progress there. But the rate of GDP growth from 1990 up to the early 2000s in Africa is basically about the same as for the high-income countries. Africa hasn't been catching up at all in the last decade or so, but at least it's not falling further behind as it was in the 1980s. I guess the hope for Africa would be that perhaps South Africa might have a strong enough economy to help stimulate some growth in the rest of the continent. But many people in Africa continue to eke out a subsistence living in countries that are ill-governed at best and in turmoil and civil war at worst. That takes us all the way around the world, but I want to spend just a minute talking about the specific situation of China and India, the two countries in the world with the largest populations. China had about 1.3 billion people in 2002. India had over 1 billion people. So these two countries together, China and India, together have about 37% of the world population. Now, both countries are still very poor. China has a per capita GDP of about $1,000. India is about half that. But both countries have also experienced some relatively robust growth in the last couple of decades. China's real GDP has been growing at about 10% per year for the quarter century after 1980. India's real GDP, while not that fast, has grown at almost 6% per year for the quarter century after 1980. Remember the power of rapid growth rates. At a 10% annual rate of growth, China's economy increased by a multiple of almost 11 in just those 25 years. At a 6% rate of growth, India's economy will more than quadruple in just 25 years. The single biggest change for the very poorest people in the world in the last few decades is the explosive growth of China and India. The growth in those countries has lifted more people out of the lowest subsistence poverty levels faster than any other event in human history. Moreover, it's interesting that they're doing it a little bit differently. China has really focused on manufacturing and has a sort of an undemocratic political system which is letting the manufacturing sector, in a way, kind of run wild. India has focused more on the service sector within a democratic political system that's kind of reforming itself toward a greater market orientation. Given those differences, I wouldn't be stunned if in a few decades India's economic future was actually somewhat brighter than China's. From a global perspective, over the next few decades, what really matters is economic growth. In particular, can long-run economic growth be sustained in the high-income countries? Can growth take off in the lower-income countries and help them close the gap? Let's think about what are the key barriers that might prevent this from happening, that might discourage growth from happening. And of course, this wouldn't be an economics lecture or an economics course if we didn't at least think about some gloomy sentiments. For example, will misguided government economic policies cause economic turmoil? Well, Mistakes will be made sometimes, of course, but there seems no particular reason in the next few decades to expect an outbreak of terrible economic policy all over the globe. Indeed, an optimist might go further and say that maybe the world has actually learned something from the experience of the old Soviet Union and the old communist China. The world has actually learned something about the value of market forces. From looking at Japan and East Asia, we've learned something about benefits from trade. From experiences of the 1980s, we've learned something about the problems of enormous budget deficits, printing money, and creating hyperinflation. We've learned something about the value of widespread education and health policies to help build human capital. So I don't think that that's likely to drag down world economic growth. Will war disrupt long-run economic growth? I think the answer is probably not. Yes, there are places in the world where small countries like North Korea are building their own nuclear weapons. Maybe China will overreach and start a war over Taiwan. Maybe the tensions between India and Pakistan will heat up. Maybe one of the wars in Africa will spread, or one of the civil disturbances in the Middle East will turn worse. But it's worth remembering that a lot of political change has happened without widespread war. I'm thinking, for example, of the breakup of the Soviet Union. There was constant fear that the Cold War might heat up, but in the end, the Soviet Union disintegrated more or less peacefully. The same could be said of the arrival of a degree of capitalism in China. It's also worth remembering that although being in a war zone is of course very harmful to the smooth functioning of an economy, the damage can also be repaired. I mean, think of the recovery of Europe's economies after the devastation of World War II. Will a trade war cripple the global economy? Well, economic historians teach there was a previous age of globalization. It happened from the end of the 19th century up until about World War I. But that age of globalization ended in a series of world wars, political reactions against trade, and Great Depression. Could that all happen again? The world does have now more than 50 years of momentum toward more free trade since the end of World War II. And despite the fact that every trade agreement is a major political battle, this general momentum toward free trade seems to me extremely difficult to stop. After all, the costs of trade keep falling. Communications keeps getting easier. Management of global businesses, the legal and financial issues, the transportation issues for going across international borders are all getting somewhat easier over time. And the economic gains from taking advantage of trade are only going to continue. So I sort of expect that process to be ongoing. Will an energy shortage stop long-run growth? Well, over the next 30 to 40 years, prices of current energy sources like oil and natural gas may well rise. But there's little reason, looking at the projections that are out there, to expect an outright shortfall where there just won't be energy available. I'd say that beyond that 40-year window, it gets a lot harder to say for a variety of reasons. At the very long term, the hope is that emerging technology may uncover new energy sources to exploit, or more efficient ways to make use of resources, or substitutes for energy in one way or another. It's worth noting that a lot of the economic gains of recent years, like information and computer technology, are not heavily dependent on extremely heavy energy use. I mean, they require some electricity, but they're not like heavy industry in that way. So I don't think an energy crunch is going to derail the world economy, at least for a few decades. Will an environmental crisis stop long-run growth? Well, one way or another, we're going to need to pay for a clean environment. Either you pay because you're living in a dirty environment, or you pay to clean it up. The U.S. economy pays something like 2 to 3% of GDP on costs related to keeping the environment clean. And the good news is that this share of keeping the environment clean seems to be more or less constant. It's not increasing over time. So as the economy grows, we can continue to make things cleaner without committing ever more resources. The other good news is that rapidly growing economies like China and India and Mexico have become much more aware of the environment than the U.S. was, say, a century ago. And the quality of air and water in those countries, while it's not great by U.S. standards, is actually typically improving. In general, a richer world will be more willing to spend resources on environmental protection. In fact, if we were to tax energy sources for environmental purposes, like reducing the risk that greenhouse warming might occur, we would also increase incentives for conserving energy and reduce that earlier concern that we might run into a problem of energy running out. Will population growth outstrip world economic growth? In the 1960s and 1970s, you could read a lot about how rapid population growth was going to overwhelm economic growth very soon. The current thinking is quite a bit different. The current thinking focuses on the idea that countries go through a demographic transition, where birth rates come way, way down and health and life expectancy go way, way up. In Japan and countries across Europe, this demographic transition is so strong that populations are expected to actually start declining, and declining substantially in the next half century. Even in many low-income countries, like countries in Europe or in Africa and in South Asia, birth rates are way, way down from what they were in the 1960s and 1970s. As my wife likes to note, it's pretty amazing what happens when women get a little more education and contraception becomes widely available. The current projections are that world population may well top out around about 2050 and then actually be flat or declining after that. Sometimes it seems as if the global economy is nothing but a threat to the United States. But the future economy is going to have remarkable opportunities along with its challenges. Sometimes when you listen to politics in the United States, it's like everything is threatening. All trade is potentially threatening. It's threatening if it's trade with a high-wage country like Japan or Germany. It's threatening if it's trade with a low-wage country like China or India. International trade is certainly a force for disruption, but it's also a spur for economic growth. At the end of the day, I think here's one of the fundamental questions people need to ask. Would you prefer to live in a world where the U.S. economy grows at 3% per year and the rest of the world grows at an average of 5% per year? So the U.S. has 3% growth, but the rest of the world is catching up. Or would you rather live in a world where the U.S. economy averages 2% growth a year and the rest of the world averages 1% a year? Do you prefer a faster absolute rate of growth for the U.S. economy? Or do you prefer the U.S. staying ahead of the other countries of the world and the other countries not being able to catch up? To a large extent, a lot of issues of globalization are questions about whether the U.S. is going to grow along with the rest of the world or whether the rest of the world is going to be somehow held back while the U.S. tries to maintain a certain edge. Most economists prefer a higher absolute rate of growth and recognize the rest of the world may grow more quickly, and we view that as a good thing too. Ultimately, each nation has control over its own economic growth, as determined by its own policies. No one is forced by globalization to enact bad policies. For example, nations can decide whether or not they're going to encourage long-term savings and investment in a market-oriented context, and how they're going to increase productivity. Other nations, when they grow, are not growing at the expense of the United States. The United States is not growing at the expense of other nations. The world economy is not a zero-sum game with a fixed amount of growth. Instead, it's a cooperative venture where we can all grow more quickly if we work together in networks of trade and production and technology and knowledge going all around the world. Each nation within this network remains responsible for its own destiny. If nations undertake policies that build human capital, that help build physical capital, that create new technology, and that lead to a better legal and financial infrastructure for supporting markets, then those nations are going to tend to grow. Nations which can't put together that package of ingredients are not going to grow. Now, there are certainly reasons to be concerned over the future competitive position of the U.S. economy. For example, with human capital, there are big issues about how can we improve K through 12 education so U.S. workers of the future will have a really solid level of basic education. There are questions about whether the U.S. is educating enough scientists and engineers to really deal with the new technologies of the future. There are macroeconomic questions about the level of savings and the level of investment that occur. How will the United States, for example, address the extremely large budget deficits that it's projected to have several decades into the future? How is this country going to deal with the aging of its population and the large projected rise in Social Security and especially Medicare spending? And when we think about new technology, really one of the main drivers of economic growth, is the U.S. spending enough on research and development? With intellectual property rights, are we providing the right kind of incentives for future growth? These are all real problems, but they're also problems that the U.S. is going to need to face by itself. In that way, our future is really in our own hands.